Well, I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed that long lunch break. It was a real blessing because we're studying some very intense things. What we're going to do this afternoon is go back to page 323, and we're going to review what we studied in our last session, and it's going to be very quick. But before we do, we want to do what we always do before we begin a class, and that is to ask the Lord's blessing. Father, thank you for the good food we've been able to enjoy, for the fellowship, for being able to discuss these things from your holy word. And we ask now that in this afternoon session that you will be with us to guide our thoughts, open our hearts, and empower us to proclaim this wonderful message to the world. We want to see the salvation of as many souls as possible, and you have called us to proclaim the truth. Thank you for the promise of your presence, and we claim that promise in the holy and precious name of Jesus. Amen. Okay. How many books in the book of Daniel? What is the first book? 1 through 7. And the second? Duh, it must be 8 through 12, right? Now, how many cycles in Daniel 7? 4 cycles. Wow. Repetitive cycles. Regarding the second book, let me ask you this. What does it mean to run to and fro? It means that you're running around searching for the truth, right? Your eyes are rolling around on the pages to discover the truth. That's what it means. Now, we gave 5 reasons why Daniel 8 through 12 is a book within a book, that the sealing of the book was not the sealing of the totality of the book of Daniel. So, what are those reasons? Number 1, it is in 2 different languages. 2 through 7, Aramaic, 8 through 12, Hebrew. That gives us the impression that there's a distinction between the 2 parts. Number 2, a great portion of Daniel could be understood before the time of the end. It wasn't sealed. Could people understand the 70 weeks before the unsealing of the book? Of course they could. It tells you all about Christ. It was understood before. You know, that the Messiah was going to be cut off in the middle of the week and he was going to be anointed and everything. That could be understood. Could the ram and the he-goat be understood? Of course. Almost everything could be understood. What could not be understood? The time element and the event of the investigative judgment to receive the kingdom before the second coming of Christ. Is that point clear? And it'll become clearer when we study Daniel chapter 8. What is the third reason why we know that the entire book of Daniel was not sealed? Because of some clear statements from the writings of Ellen White. She said so clearly, didn't she? She says, that which has to do with the judgment in the last days, the relationship to time is what was sealed, not what led up to that, because not the reference points that lead us to that moment. Number 4, the internal content of the book, of this little book, indicates that Daniel 8 through 12 have a common theme. And that common theme is a 2300-day prophecy and the beginning of the investigative judgment. And we went chapter by chapter. Chapter 8 mentions the 2300 days, but it does not give us what? A starting point. So where would you expect the starting point? In chapter 9. And chapter 9 tells us that 70 weeks are cut off from the 2300 days. And we know when the 70 weeks start, from the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. We know that's 457 BC. Now we have a starting point for the 2300 days. And then in chapter 10, did the devil like that idea? Oh no, now he's going to struggle with the minds of the kings of Persia to try and convince them not to favor the Jews so that these decrees cannot come when they're supposed to be coming. Are you following me or not? So is chapter 10 related to this whole theme of the time periods and the investigative judgment? Yes. Satan wants to nip it in the bud, if you please. He wants to eliminate the possibility from the very beginning. And then we have chapter 11. Now we're to the place where we ended last time. Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is a rehash of chapter 8, but with one big difference. In chapter 8, Gabriel did not complete the explanation of the vision. Why didn't Gabriel complete the explanation of the vision? Because when he got to the 2,300 days and the sanctuary will be cleansed, Daniel said, I don't understand. In fact, when the chapter ends, he says, I didn't understand. What didn't he understand? Did he understand the ram? Yes. Of course he did. Did he understand the he-goat? Did he understand the notable horn? Did he understand the 4 divisions? He understood all of that. Even maybe the little horn. But what he did not understand is how the 2,300 days are related to the 70 weeks. He's just totally oblivious to that. And so he wants more information. And so we find in Daniel chapter 11 verse 1 through chapter 12 verse 3, Gabriel returns to complete the explanation of Daniel 8. He's going to begin at the same starting point, but he's going to go far beyond the 2,300 days, the beginning of the judgment. He's going to go to the conclusion of the judgment. He's going to go all the way to the everlasting kingdom. What he left unexplained in chapter 8, he's going to explain in chapter 11. By the way, that's the reason why there is not a new vision in Daniel 11. Because Daniel 11 is the explanation of the vision already given in Daniel 8. Are you following me or not? So let's notice the sequence in Daniel chapter 11, so you see the connection with Daniel 8. We're at page 335, just below the middle of the page. Well, let's actually begin where it says Daniel 11, verse 1 to 12:3. In chapter 11, Gabriel will complete the explanation that he suspended in Daniel 8. It is important to underline that there is no new vision in this chapter, only an explanation. This indicates that Daniel 11 is a further explanation or expansion of the vision of Daniel 8, because there is no other chain vision between chapter 8 and chapter 11. So you can't just come out of the blue and start giving an explanation without a vision. Gabriel will begin the explanation of the vision of Daniel 8 at the same starting point. So now let's notice the sequence of events in Daniel 11. By the way, we're going to come back to this when we talk about Ellen White's concept of end-time events. As in Daniel 11, the explanation as in Daniel 8, the explanation of Daniel 11 begins during the kingdom of what? Persia. Persia is mentioned by name. And by the way, you know what's interesting? After Daniel 8, where it speaks about the ram being the kings of Media and Persia, from that point on, it never refers to Medes and Persians. It always refers to Persia, because the Medes have passed away. Do you remember that one of the horns was taller than the other one and the other one came up last? Well, that was Persia. It can be proven from history. So then, what is the next kingdom in Daniel 11? Greece. Does Daniel 11 mention the first king? Yes, that's the notable horn, isn't it? Next, what do you have? The kingdom is divided into what? Into 4 parts. Is this going back to where Daniel 8 began? It most certainly is. And then you have the chapter describes the dominion of pagan Rome. In other words, a little horn extends geographically, horizontally. But then the little horn morphs into a religious horn. Did we find that in Daniel chapter 7 as well? Yeah, the iron legs of Daniel 2 and the dragon beast of Daniel chapter 7. And then a little horn comes up from the head of this dragon beast among the 10 horns. So first of all, you have pagan Rome that extends geographically, and when we study Daniel 8, we're going to see this. And then you have papal Rome. Then when you get, by the way, from chapter 11, all the way from verse 1 to verse 39, it's describing these kingdoms. It's describing Persia, it's describing Greece, the first king of Greece, the 4 kingdoms into which Greece was divided, then pagan Rome extending horizontally, then papal Rome. And when you get to verse 39, there you have the end of the career of the 1260 years of papal Rome. In verse 40, you have the deadly wound. And you have to accept this by faith now, but we're going to study this, and you're going to see that when it says that at the time of the end, the king of the south would attack the king of the north. The king of the north is the papacy. Who attacked the papacy at the beginning of the time of the end in 1798? It was France, right? That gave the papacy its deadly wound. And so in verse 40, it begins with the deadly wound. And then it speaks about the king of the north recovering his power and extending globally. And then it speaks about it, basically it's conquering the whole world from the river Euphrates all the way to Egypt. And at the end of time, we don't apply the geography, we apply the principle that the little horn the king actually conquered the whole world of that time. At the end of time, it's globalized. We're going to notice this as we study along. And so then you get to the point where news from the north and from the east troubles the king of the north. What are the tidings from the north and the east that trouble the king of the north, that trouble the papacy? Well, where does the sealing angel come from? From the east. And where does the angel that fills the earth with his glory come from? He comes from heaven. That's north. Because that's where Lucifer wanted to establish his own throne. He says, in the sides of the what? Of the north. So it's the loud cry and the sealing that angers the king of the north. And what does he do? He goes out to attempt to destroy many. And when he proclaims a death decree, what does Michael do? He stands up. What does stand up mean? We're going to study this. Standing up means he begins to reign. You find it earlier in the chapter, Daniel 11, verses 2 and 3. Stand up means to begin to reign. Why does Jesus begin to reign? He's Michael. Why does he begin to reign? Because the judgment has already revealed who are subjects of his kingdom. I don't know if you're following me or not. Maybe too much lunch? And so Michael stands up to defend his people. And what's going to happen with God's people? Does he defend them instantly? No, they're going to go through what? Through a time of trouble such has never been seen in the history of the world. But what's going to happen? What's going to happen when Michael stands up to defend his people? His people go through the time of trouble, but at the end of the time of trouble, they will be what? They will be delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book. Excuse me, when is it that their names were retained in the book? During the investigative judgment. Are you following me? See, all of this fits together perfectly. And so then, God's people, God's living saints are delivered from the death decree. And then you have the special resurrection. Many who lie in the dust of the earth, who sleep in the dust of the earth, will rise. Some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting contempt. And then God's people shine as the stars forever. Daniel 8 did not conclude with the everlasting kingdom. It ends, Daniel 8 ended with the 2300 days. Daniel got sick. So now Gabriel comes back and he says, now I'm going to explain what was left unexplained, but to give you a reference point, I'm going to start where I started in Daniel 8. Raise your hand if you're understanding what I'm saying. Well, half of you. That's all right. Read the notes. Struggle with the notes. There is a lot of very valuable information here. And then what happens? Then the little book is sealed. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. The little book is sealed. When were all these things going to be understood? In the time of the end. When does the time of the end begin? 1798. That's when the time of the end begins. So, Daniel chapter 11 is the expansion of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8. That's what I want you to notice now. But there's a fifth reason why Daniel 12 verse 4, the little book, is that part of Daniel that has to do with a 2300-day prophecy. And for that, we have to go to Revelation 10, which we're not going to do because we don't have the time. But you have the notes here in the study notes. During the period of the sixth trumpet, I have just a synthesis of this on page 337. During the period of the sixth trumpet, would that be near the end time? The sixth trumpet? Yeah, during the period of the sixth trumpet, something is opened in Revelation chapter 10. What is opened? A little book. An angel descends from heaven, we're told there. And the angel imparts a message. It's the same message that was imparted to Daniel back in Daniel chapter 8. And this passage describes the entire Millerite movement. And you can see it in the study notes, the entire Millerite movement. Just one aspect that I'll mention. Remember that John was told to eat the book? Yes. The little book? Eat the little book? Yes. What happened when he ate the little book? It was sweet in his mouth, but then it became bitter in his stomach. So at first when he eats it, it's sweet. That represents the joy that the Millerites had expecting the coming of Jesus. But then in the aftermath, it became bitter because Jesus did not come. Study all those pages of Revelation chapter 10, and you'll see that what is being studied there is the time element and the beginning of the judgment. You know, there's a verse there in Revelation chapter 10 that says that time will be no longer. When this message is proclaimed, time is no longer. What time is it referring to? It's referring to the 2300 days. You know, this 2300 days is the last time prophecy that we find of end time events. After that, there are no time prophecies. So, is there a connection between time being no longer in Revelation 10 and the prophecy of the 2300 days that is given in Daniel chapter 8? Yes, when the 2300 days end, then there will be no more time prophecies. By the way, this cannot be, when it says time will be no longer, cannot be referring to the second coming of Christ. Because this is happening during the sixth trumpet, and the second coming is during the seventh trumpet. So this is happening before. And furthermore, this cannot refer to the close of probation or the second coming, because after eating the book and being sweet in the mouth and bitter in the stomach, John is told, go prophesy again. Well, if the second coming had already taken place when time is no longer, what would be the use of going to prophesy again? Are you following me or not? So when it says time will be no longer, it must be referring to a different kind of time than chronological time. It's dealing with prophetic time. So all those are the reasons why this little book was sealed in the times of Daniel, and the aspect of the judgment and the timing of the judgment is what is unsealed at the time of the end. Of course, we need all the reference points, don't we? Do we need all the reference points? Imagine God saying, there was this angel that came down from heaven with the little book open in his hands, and we didn't have Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. So now, what is this? But when you connect it with Daniel 12, verse 4, the little book that's sealed, now he descends and the book is open, you know that Revelation 10 is expanding upon Daniel chapter 8, more specifically Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. Is that clear? All right. Let's go now to page 395. Page 395, and let's study a little bit about Daniel 8. You know, I debated in my mind whether I would do what we just did after studying Daniel 8 or before studying Daniel 8. I decided to do it before we studied Daniel 8 so that you can see the connection between Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. But as we move along, these things are going to become clearer in your mind. Page 395. Daniel 8 is dated to the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. He was the one who was ruling in Babylon when Babylon fell. This was in 550 BC, which means that it was 11 years before the fall of Babylon. That's an important detail. It's during the reign of Belshazzar, his 3rd year, the year 550 BC. As noted before, Daniel is actually 2 books in one. Chapters 1 through 7 are the first book, chapter 8 through 12 are the second book. And it is the same little book that is opened at the time of the end in Revelation chapter 10. Daniel 8 follows the same basic sequence of events as Daniel 7. But now notice, but there are 4 significant differences between Daniel 7, the sequence of Daniel 7, and the sequence of powers in Daniel chapter 8. What are the 4 differences? First of all, Daniel 7 has a lion, which is a symbol for Babylon, whereas in Daniel 8 there is no symbol for Babylon. Daniel 8 begins with Medo-Persia. So the question is, why is Babylon absent in the vision of Daniel chapter 8? Well, different explanations have been given. One explanation is that Babylon is assumed because Belshazzar is the king of Babylon at that time. A second explanation, which I consider to be a better explanation, is that perhaps Babylon is about to disappear from history, and so it's not included. The problem with that is that Babylon was not about to disappear because there were still 11 years of the rule of Babylon. The best explanation is very simple, and that is that the 2300 days begin during the reign of which kingdom? Medo-Persia. If Babylon had been included, it would have given the impression that the 2300 days would begin during the period of Babylon. Are you understanding this point? That's the reason why it begins with Medo-Persia, because the 2300 days begin in the period of Medo-Persia. That's the first difference between Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Daniel 7 has a symbol for Babylon. Daniel 8 does not, for the reason that I mentioned. The second difference is that the beasts of Daniel 7 are all carnivorous, whereas the beasts of Daniel chapter 8 are domestic. The ram was the animal that was used in the daily service of the sanctuary, morning and evening. And the he-goat was used on the Day of Atonement in the yearly service. This indicates that different than Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 7 is dealing with the judgment from a judicial perspective, whereas Daniel 8 is dealing with the same topic, but from the frame reference of the sanctuary. That is, that the judgment of Daniel chapter 7 is the same as the cleansing of the sanctuary in Daniel chapter 8. Two different perspectives, not contradictory, but complementary. The third difference is very interesting. The third difference is that in Daniel chapter 7, you have two separate symbols for pagan Rome and papal Rome. You have a dragon beast that represents pagan Rome, and you have, on the other hand, a little horn that represents papal Rome. But in Daniel chapter 8, you only have one little horn that represents pagan Rome and papal Rome. One little horn represents both. And this should not trouble us, because we're going to find that Rome, first of all, governed, according to Daniel chapter 8, horizontally, and then it morphed into attack of the heavenly sanctuary. So we need to understand that there's only one horn in Daniel chapter 8 because both stages of Rome are found in that little horn. And we have some very important points that I'm going to share in just a few moments. Now, what would have happened if God had told Daniel to put a third beast in this order of powers in Daniel chapter 8? It would have ruined the sanctuary perspective. God wanted to say that the sanctuary service is at the center of Daniel chapter 8. The daily and the yearly service. And you know, it's really interesting. The little horn, we're going to find in Daniel 8, thought to take away the daily. And God will judge it in the yearly. There you have the daily beast and the yearly beast, indicating that the theme is the daily service of Christ, or the continual ministry of Christ in the sanctuary, and the judgment of the little horn on the Day of Atonement. That's why you have the he-goat. So God did not include another beast because it would have ruined the central emphasis on the daily and the yearly service of the sanctuary. That's the third difference. Finally, this is very interesting. While Daniel 7 culminates with the setting up of Christ's everlasting kingdom, Daniel 8 does not reach that conclusion. Daniel 8 reaches to the end of the 2300 days, not beyond that. And so that's a difference between Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. So would you expect Daniel 8 to be expanded upon later on to include all of the other elements? I would say yes. Now let's go to the top of page 397. The evidence indicates that Daniel 8 through 12 is an inseparable unit whose central theme is the 2300-day prophecy. The unit actually begins with the last event in the prophetic chain of Daniel 7 and does not conclude until the setting up of the everlasting kingdom in Daniel 12, verses 1 to 3. Let's express it a different way. Daniel 8:14 and the last event of Daniel 7 describes the beginning of the judgment. And Daniel 12, 1 to 3 presents the conclusion of the judgment and the everlasting kingdom. In between these two markers, we find the specific date for the beginning of the 2300 days, the struggle between Christ and Satan for the time decrees to be given, and finally an expansion of the prophecy of Daniel 8 from the kingdom of Persia till the end of the judgment and the setting up of Christ's everlasting kingdom. So I ask you again, is Daniel 8 through 12 a unit with a central theme? Yes, and what is the theme? The theme is the investigative judgment At the end of the 2200 days, and of course Daniel chapter 12 takes us beyond that to the standing up of Michael, which is when the sanctuary service closes. So Daniel 8 through 12 gives us the beginning of the judgment. It gives a date, and it also gives us the moment when probation closes. It doesn't give a date when probation closes, but when Michael stands up, the judgment is finished. So we have the beginning of the judgment, and we have the ending of the judgment. Now let's get into this chapter more specifically. Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 to 13, which has the vision itself, has a strong emphasis on seeing. The word for seeing, the word for vision here, is the word chazon in Hebrew, or in Aramaic rather. That's an important detail to remember. The word for vision is chazon in Daniel chapter 8. Now let's go to verses 1 through 4 with that in mind, with the word chazon in mind. That's an important point. Let's go, and we'll notice that Daniel saw, which is denoted by the word eyes, saw, and behold. Notice verse 2. And I saw in a chazon. And it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a chazon. You say, why are you emphasizing that word, chazon? There's a very special reason, because later in the chapter we're going to find a different word for vision. And so it says, I was by the river Ulai. Then Daniel saw a ram conquering everything in its path. Let's read about it. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, there's the word saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. What is that parallel to in Daniel 7? Daniel 7, the bear was higher on one side than the other. It doesn't say when it was higher than the other, but Daniel 8 adds the detail that this ram has 2 horns, one is higher than the other, and the highest one came out last. And we've already talked about what that means. And so it continues saying, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. Is he messing with heaven here? Is the ram on war against God in heaven? No. It says westward, northward, and southward. He's conquering geographically, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Remember that word, great. So the ram became what? Great. So Daniel saw a ram next to the river Ulai, and the ram had 2 horns, but one of them was higher than the other. The highest one came up last. And as I mentioned before, this is parallel to the bear of Daniel chapter 7. Now, what do these 2 horns represent? We don't have to guess, because verse 20 says, the ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. There's a parallel between Daniel 5 and Daniel 8. Daniel 5 proves that the next kingdom is Medo-Persia after Babylon. Daniel 5 tells us that Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians. And Daniel 8 verse 2 explains that the 2 horns were the kings of Media and Persia. However, after Daniel 8, and I already mentioned this, the kingdom is referred to, without exception, as Persia. Because if you see that dynastic chart at the end of the study notes, you're going to find there that for the last 200 years, all of the kings were Persians. The Medes have disappeared from history. Now, after Darius was a Mede, Cyrus and Cambyses, they were all Medes, after they died, all the remaining rulers from 522 to 331 BC were Persian. The point is that the tallest horn did come up last. And I mentioned what you have at the end of your study notes. There are other parallels between the bear of Daniel 7 and the ram of Daniel 8. In Daniel 7, the bear was higher on one side than on the other. And also, in Daniel 7, the bear had what? 3 ribs in its mouth. And in Daniel 8, the ram conquered in 3 points of the compass. It went westward, that would be Babylon, northward, Lydia, and southward, Egypt. 3 horns, 3 directions of the compass. The text tells us that the ram became great. We will soon encounter another power that became very great, and still another after which became exceeding great. The ram conquered only how? Horizontally. That is to say, the ram warred against other beasts on earth, but it did not war vertically against the God of heaven. We will soon encounter a power that would war against the God of heaven. Now let's notice verses 5 through 8. Daniel says, "And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground." Remember the leopard? Is the leopard a swift animal? Yes, but the leopard has 4 wings. It's especially quick in its conquest. So it says it touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler, that means anger against him, and smote the ram and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore, the goat waxed, how? Oh, very great. So the ram was what? Great. The he-goat is what? Very great. And now notice, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Who is the great horn? Alexander the Great. And what happens then? And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. So, is that an expansion of Daniel chapter 7? Of course it is. How many heads did the leopard have? He had 4 heads. Now the kingdom is divided into 4 horns. So, were all 4 horns on the head of this beast when the beast rose to power? No, Daniel 7 simply gives us the total picture, the total career of the leopard. Now, verses 5 through 8, we once again find a marked emphasis on seeing. The he-goat moves from west to east, and it is geographically true that Greece is west of Persia. Incontestably, the he-goat of Daniel 8 is parallel to the leopard of Daniel 7. We can be sure for the following 2 reasons. Number 1, Daniel 8 tells us that the he-goat conquered so swiftly that it did not even touch the earth. The leopard is swift with 4 wings, even swifter. This he-goat is so swift that he's flying through the air. So you have that parallel. Second, after the great horn on the head of the he-goat was broken, it sprouted 4 horns. This is parallel to the leopard of 7, which has 4 heads. Are you catching the parallels? Is Daniel 8 following the basic sequence of Daniel chapter 7, with the exception of Babylon for the reason that I mentioned? Absolutely. This is an expansion of Daniel 7 because now there's going to be more information primarily about the judgment. And there's also additional information about the previous beasts. When we compare the leopard of Daniel 7 with the he-goat of Daniel 8, we conclude that the leopard had two periods of existence. The first was during the reign of the notable horn, and the second was after the notable horn was broken and 4 came up in its place. Now, which kingdom does the he-goat represent? We don't have to guess. The prophecy itself explains in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 21 that the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. We don't even have to guess. We know that the next kingdom is Greece. Of course, the first king of the Hellenistic age was Alexander the Great. The speed at which he conquered was amazing. Somebody told me yesterday that it was there was actually 7 years. This I got from Bill Shea at the seminary. He was my teacher in Old Testament history, and in his book he says it's 3 years, but 3 years or 7 years, that's still pretty fast. When you consider that Nebuchadnezzar took 3 years just to conquer Jerusalem, and Assyria took 3 years to conquer Samaria. So if it's 3 years or 7 years, from the Indus Valley all the way to the river Euphrates, that is really quick conquest. It came to the point where Alexander the Great didn't have any more to conquer. So you know how he died. He died of intoxication. Greece did run against the Medo-Persian Empire in the fury of his power and did break his 2 horns. The prophecy tells us that Alexander the Great was broken when he was strong. Do you know how old he was when he died? He was in his early 30s when he died. Super young. So he was broken when he was strong, or at the apex of his power. Kingdoms in antiquity always grew strong in the course of time, and then weakened and fell to the enemy. However, Alexander died at the tender age of 33, and when he was at the height of his power, it is said that he died of alcoholic intoxication. So let's look now at the stages of Greek history. The founder, Alexander the Great. The dates are 334 to 323 BC. Then you have the 4 kingdoms, the Antigonids. That's Macedonia and Greece in the west, from 283 BC to 168 BC. Then you have the Attalids. The Attalids, that's Pergamum in the north, from 263 to 133 BC. Then you have the Ptolemies. That's Egypt in the south, from 323 to 30 BC. And then you have the Seleucids, Syria and Mesopotamia in the east, from 323 to 264 BC. Now let's talk a little bit more about the 4 kingdoms into which the kingdom of Alexander the Great was divided. It is generally thought that the 4 kingdoms are actually the kingdoms that were ruled over the 4 generals of Alexander's empire. Those generals were Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. However, this traditional interpretation is not without its problems. First, the 4 horns are clearly identified as kingdoms, not kings. Second, it is a historical fact that Alexander's kingdom was not carved up into 4 neat kingdoms immediately after he died. We usually think he died and you have 4 kingdoms. If you look at history, the history of Greece, it's very complex. Sometimes there were 3 kingdoms. Sometimes there were 4. And sometimes, for a short period, there were only 2 kingdoms. Now, for a fuller explanation of this, you can look at the additional material that is mentioned there. Let me read a statement by secular historian W. Tarn, which helps us understand the division of Alexander's empire. He, that is Alexander, left no heir and had made no arrangements for carrying on the government. Does this kind of fit with Daniel chapter 8? Most certainly does. Once the uprisings of Greece in the Lamian War and of the Greeks in the Far East were defeated, a struggle for power started among his generals in the shape of war between the satraps, that is the territorial dynasts, and whatever central power aimed at general control. The Battle of Ipsus in 301 definitely decided that the Greco-Macedonian world could not be held together, and that world presently returned very much to the political shape it had before Alexander, though under different rulers and a different civilization. By 275, 3 dynasties descended from 3 of his generals. They were well established. The Seleucids ruled much of what had been the Persian Empire in Asia. The Ptolemies ruled in Egypt, and the Antigonids in Macedonia. A 4th European dynasty, not connected with Alexander, the Attalids of Pergamum, subsequently grew up in Asia Minor at Seleucid expense and became great by the favor of Rome. Now, the difference in this interpretation is that the 4th kingdom is Pergamum. That's different than what is generally taught concerning these 4 kingdoms. Now, from page 402 to 416, I go through some extensive history. And what I'm going to do is simply synthesize this historical material to show you that pagan Rome actually originated, pagan Rome got its civilization and culture from Asia Minor, from Pergamum, in other words. That's significant. So let's deal with from the winds or from the horns. The all-important question remains to be answered. Did the little horn come forth from one of the 4 horns or from one of the 4 winds? Before we can answer this question, we must deal with 2 points that are very closely related. The first is this: Seventh-day Adventists, with few exceptions, have always correctly taught that the little horn of Daniel 7 and the little horn of Daniel 8 represent the same power, namely the Roman Catholic papacy. However, this interpretation has presented a seemingly unsurmountable problem. The little horn of Daniel 7 rose from the head of the dragon beast, which symbolizes what? Pagan Rome. So in Daniel 7, the little horn rises from pagan Rome. But now notice, however, the little horn of Daniel 8 seemed to rise from one of the 4 divisions of the Greek Empire. Are you understanding the problem? How could the little horn rise both from one of the divisions of Greece and also from Rome? How can we resolve this apparent discrepancy? Are you understanding the problem? Most Adventist authors have attempted to resolve this problem by claiming that the little horn did not rise from one of the 4 horns, but rather from one of the 4 winds of heaven. The reason for this interpretation is that the expression, the 4 winds of heaven, is much more indefinite than the expression 4 horns. If the little horn rose from one of the 4 winds of heaven, it could arise just about anywhere, including Rome. However, if it rose from one of the 4 horns, it would have to rise specifically from one of the 4 Hellenistic kingdoms. Are you understanding this? I believe that the attempt to prove that the little horn came forth from one of the winds and not from one of the horns is well intended, but unnecessary. So let's examine the Hebrew text to see what the Hebrew text says. Then we're going to compare Maccabees, the first Maccabees. That's not an inspired source, but it quotes this verse. Let's examine also the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And we'll also examine Flavius Josephus, who also quoted this particular verse from Daniel chapter 8. Let's read, first of all, the text literally reads as such. This is Daniel chapter 8. It says there, Daniel chapter 8, verses 8 and 9. 4 notable ones, that's horns, toward the 4 winds. In other words, 4 notable horns came from the 4 winds. And out of one of them, in other words, out of one of the horns at the 4 winds came forth a little horn. Now let's notice what 1 Maccabees 1:10 has to say. Alexander had reigned 12 years when he died. Each of his comrades established himself in his own region. All assumed crowns after his death, they and their heirs after them for many years, bringing increasing evils on the world. From these, what does it mean from these? The antecedent is each assumed their own crowns, right? So it's really the Greek rulers and their kingdoms. From these grew a sinful offshoot. And of course, this is where it's a mistake. It says Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. So he's wrong. The first Maccabees is wrong about Antiochus fulfilling this, but he's right that the little horn came forth from one of the kingdoms that were at the 4 winds. Now, notice also the Septuagint translation. And 4 other horns rose up in its place toward the 4 winds of heaven. 4 horns at 4 winds. And out of one of them, what is the antecedent? 4 horns from the 4 winds. Out of one of them came forth one strong horn, which is the little horn. And then we have Flavius Josephus, who, by the way, believed that the little horn also was Antiochus Epiphanes. They lived at that time, and Antiochus Epiphanes, had sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. He desecrated the temple, etc. So Flavius Josephus, as well as Maccabees and the Septuagint, believed that Antiochus Epiphanes was the fulfillment. But notice what Flavius Josephus said. He, Daniel, saw a very great horn, that's Alexander, growing out of the head of the he-goat, and that when it was broken off, 4 horns grew up that were opposed to each other of the 4 winds. Exposed, to each of the 4 winds. And he wrote that out of them, out of what? 4 horns, out of them arose another lesser horn, which, as he said, waxed great. So the little horn actually rises from the 4 horns at the 4 winds. You can't simply say it was at one of the winds, so basically that could mean Rome, because that means anywhere. The 4 winds mean just anywhere. The little horn rises from from one of the horns that is at the 4 winds. But we still have the problem. How is it that the little horn rises from one of the horns of the Greek Empire, from one of the 4 kingdoms into which the kingdom of Alexander the Great was divided? That is what we are going to deal with in the next session together. We're going to see that Rome, actually political Rome or pagan Rome, rose from the kingdom of Pergamum. And then the little horn, the papacy, grew from the head of the dragon beast and became papal Rome. So we will deal with that in our next class. We're going to deal with a lot of history, and I trust that we're all awake because there's a lot of detail that we're going to take a look at.